Path to Paradise is funded in part by Ogden Environmental and Energy Services. Ogden specializes in conservation planning, environmental assessment, terrestrial and aquatic biology, geographic information systems, habitat restoration, bioassay testing, air quality, and hazardous materials management.
Good evening. I'm Shannon Bradley, the Public Affairs Producer for UCSD-TV. Tonight we bring you the 4th edition of Path to Paradise, our series on land use and urban planning that began last fall. We started with the history of urban planning and then followed with planning by ballot. And then we turned our attention to downtown. Tonight it's the natural environment, the valleys, canyons, and seacoast that make the region so special. What planners call the built environment has grown so much that it tends to mask the region's natural form. We see the ocean, of course, but on the other side of the freeway are lagoons, which open to river valleys that link to headwaters springing from mountains to the east. And the urban canyons, which carve our region into distinct communities, are part of ancient watersheds, with one kind of plant life on the north slopes and another on the south. And sand that used to line our beaches is trapped in submarine canyons offshore. We'll talk about how to retrieve that sand, and we'll bring you up to date on efforts to protect valleys and canyons with a habitat conservation plan that Washington calls a model for the nation. It's the MSCP, the Multiple Species Conservation Program, heralded by developers and environmentalists alike when passed, and now being challenged in court. Its fate may depend on the voters if it goes to a ballot as planned next year. Path to Paradise is produced in collaboration with Citizens Coordinate for Century 3, the region's oldest nonpartisan civic organization. And it's my pleasure to introduce C3's immediate past president, Ken Sulzer.
Good evening. C3 is proud to continue its partnership with UCSD-TV in the production of Path to Paradise. This series was inspired by Temporary Paradise, the nationally acclaimed report on San Diego that was written 25 years ago. The authors, Kevin Lynch and Donald Appleyard, outlined planning principles for sound growth that are even more critical today. They called on the region to carefully balance the needs of the built and natural environments before it was too late. C3 has assumed the role of keeping alive the legacy of Temporary Paradise as the region grapples with decisions about its future. We'd like to thank Ogden Environmental and Energy Services for underwriting tonight's program and for past support from Solomon Smith Barney, Public Financial Management, and the Burnham Foundation. We'll tell you more about C3 at the end of this program, but for now, please stay with us and enjoy the valleys, canyons, and seacoast.
Earthquakes, floods, wind, and tides carved a collection of landscapes over time that is unique in this world. Nowhere else is there such a medley of habitats, from the Pacific Ocean, up through the river valleys, to the coastal mesas rising to the foothills and climbing higher to the mountains and then descending to the desert floor. Urban planners have long recognized the value of this diversity and urged residents here to protect those natural treasures as they pursue growth and prosperity. John Nolan, who wrote a comprehensive plan for San Diego at the turn of the century, was optimistic about prospects for conservation. Some of Nolan's dreams were realized and others not. And when Kevin Lynch and Donald Appleyard came to San Diego in 1974, they too marveled at the land, but were appalled by the haphazard development that threatened its beauty. They sounded the alarm in Temporary Paradise, their classic report on the San Diego region.
Build on the mesas, they said, but preserve the valleys and canyons. Leave them open for nature trails and recreation. No more highways on these green fingers.
That was 25 years ago, and while Lynch and Appleyard's principles of respecting the land in urban design found their way into general plans for San Diego and surrounding cities, a more powerful force left many of those principles ignored. As more and more people made San Diego their home, the urgent need for housing, jobs, stores, and roads stifled efforts to implement the long-range conservation plans. And as construction projects patched the coastal mesas, surrounding habitat was severed into islands, putting dozens of native species, like the California gnatcatcher, at risk of extinction. Laws to protect the endangered wildlife led to battles between developers and environmentalists, fighting the details of each proposal over and over again and leaving both sides exhausted. This process frustrated many, like Karen Scarborough, then a landscape architect, and later an aide to San Diego Mayor Susan Golding.
There was a clash between where all of the development normally would go because of its natural tendency. Well, actually, in the past regulations of the city of San Diego, we would protect the hillsides. And the hillsides of the canyons and the river valleys created our unique quality of life, we believed, and so then we built on the mesa tops. Well, the coastal sage scrub resides on the mesa tops where the gnatcatcher resides. Gnatcatcher being a threatened, possibly endangered species, living right where all the development wanted to go. There was a potential train wreck.
Scarborough joined a diverse coalition brought together to develop a habitat protection plan that would satisfy builders looking for consistent decisions on land use and environmentalists like County Planning Commissioner Michael Beck, who also runs the Endangered Habitats League here in San Diego. For years, Beck had watched in dismay as sensitive land had succumbed to grade. He wanted to protect what was left and saw potential in this coalition.
The interest groups that were involved in the development of the plan cover the entire spectrum, well, almost the entire spectrum of interested parties. It includes large landowners representing the development community. It also included the BIA, which is the building part of the development community, the building industry. Slightly different perspectives from those two groups, but generally lining up on the development side of the equation. It included local government, which in many respects has a lot of the same interests and concerns and desires as the development community, tax revenue and so on. They have this incentive to develop in many respects, and in some respects have need to put in infrastructure systems and so forth. Also the federal wildlife agencies, both the Federal Fish and Wildlife Service and the State Department of Fish and Game, were at the table, and the environmental community as well.
And what was the coalition trying to do? What was the goal of this group?
To strike a balance between the preservation of open space and enough preservation to accommodate the survivability of the target species. We started out with looking at 93, we now have protected 85, but trying to find the balance between how much land is needed to protect those species while accommodating an economic vitality to the city that's essential to the building industry and the economic engine of our region. And that was the real goal.
Several years of negotiations led to what's known as the MSCP, or Multiple Species Conservation Program. It has marked some 172,000 acres in San Diego County to be preserved as open space. Some land is already protected. The rest must be acquired over the next 30 years.
The MSCP is a partnership essentially between the federal, state, and local government that is intended to, as I said, redefine the context within which local land use decisions are made. And in exchange for a conservation plan that includes funding and management and monitoring and a number of other things, in exchange for a conservation plan, the federal government has given some of its authority to issue permits for certain species that are protected under the conservation plan. There's 85 species that are covered under the MSCP, and about 25 or 30 of them are listed federally protected species. The others are not yet there. The idea was to not just protect those species which are listed, but to try to get ahead of the curve and to protect species that are moving in that direction, that are clearly moving in the wrong direction.
It's an ambitious experiment.
Jerry Stalkup is a biologist who worked on the MSCP.
Is an attempt to provide for long-term sustainability of endangered populations and biodiversity of the region in general. San Diego actually has more endangered species than any other region in the continental U.S. And so that fact was recognized by the development of the multiple species program, that we don't have just one species that we need to deal with, we have multiple species. And so the program is designed to protect entire ecosystems, and not only to protect and conserve them, but to establish long-term management measures and programs that would ensure that they are sustained over the long term.
Stalkup's research team studied the region to identify which areas were most worth saving.
There's little hot spots of biodiversity and sensitive species locations in the study area, and they're around the Lake Hodges area, and they're around San Vicente and Mission Trails and Del Mar Mesa, Otay Ranch and Otay Mountain.
The MSCP working group then asked for sample preserve designs, from a low-end alternative favored by developers to a high-end, which would have covered all of the biologically sensitive habitat corridors.
The plan itself is a conservation plan, and it is the conservation plan is based on the needs of the species that it's trying to conserve. And so we started with biology, but we knew that we would also need to integrate to the biological principles land uses and economic concerns. And those, since the cities and the county are responsible for land use authority in the area, we didn't want to be the ones to integrate those land use principles. While we did collect data on land use and we mapped land use and ownership, we did many economic analyses. The final decisions are policy decisions, and so we let the decision makers at the elected officials basically make the final decisions on land use and economics. This is the final map that ended up for the MSCP preserve system.
And if fully implemented, all of the colored areas shown on this map will be preserved, at least in part, forever.
There's three things that are components of implementing the program. There's acquisition of land, there's management of land, and monitoring. The management and monitoring are in perpetuity. Acquisition obligations are divided among federal, state, and local government, and thus far 50% federal and state obligations, 50% local obligations, and thus far the federal and state governments have ponied up quite well. I mean, we're ahead of schedule in terms of acquisition targets, and some significant properties have been purchased, many of which had development plans, in some cases vested maps associated with them.
One of those properties is known as Crest Ridge off Interstate 8 near Alpine.
Crest Ridge is a 2,600-acre tract of land, a very large tract of land that had an approved map right in the middle of it, separating these two larger potential open space areas. And from a reserve design standpoint, that would have been disastrous. So it's a long process, but that a process to actually acquire that land and that vested map has just been completed in the last 6 months, and it's very heartening. It's an example of what the MSCP can do beyond that which we could have done otherwise. We just didn't have the ability to go out and buy these properties.
U.S. Interior Secretary Bruce Babbitt was an early supporter of the MSCP and came to San Diego to salute its passage with those who made it happen.
We spent a lot of time talking about both the vision and the near impossibility of making it happen. And as I talked and listened and worked with this then small band of people, I came to a conclusion which they shared with me. And that was that we were at the threshold of a brand new chapter in conservation history. That if we could get this going, we would, all of us, have been present at the creation of something brand new, without any precedents, without any kind of maps or guides. And I finally came away from San Diego saying, yes, I know the odds are long, but we'll never have an opportunity and a group of dedicated people who really believe that we can create something entirely new that will set a model and a vision for the rest of the nation, precisely because it will address this question. Is it possible to develop and expand and grow, and to do it without destroying the very values that have created the growth in the first place? And is it possible out on this landscape to find an equilibrium in which we are saying, yes, we can preserve God's creation in all of its variety and extraordinary beauty, and be better for doing it, and in the process meet our obligations to the generations to come.
It's both an end and a beginning. It is the end of the acceptance and years of planning on the part of everyone. None of us could have done it alone. From the organizations that were involved, from individual property owners and the different government agencies at all levels. If anyone had not agreed to get out in front and really commit, we wouldn't be here today. Because anyone, whether it was the state government, Secretary Wheeler, or the federal government, Secretary Babbitt, County Board of Supervisors, Diane and Pam, City of San Diego, or the other cities that also participate, if any one link was gone, we would not have a far-reaching habitat preserve plan today. Jim is correct. This is also the beginning, because there is a lot of land that needs to be purchased to make this happen. But it will happen as long as we continue the cooperative planning and relationship that we have today, and the trust that has been built among the environmental organizations, the government agencies, and the business community and development community.
But the trust that Mayor Golding celebrated was challenged last December when 14 environmental groups filed a lawsuit against the MSCP. Allison Rolfe represents the lead plaintiff in the case.
What we looked at most of all was whether or not it was consistent with the federal law, the Endangered Species Act, because that's our nation's premier wildlife law. And we were really focusing in on whether or not it met those standards. One of the concerns we had was that because this is such a large regional plan and it's so grand in scope, it lacked really the detail that it needed to make sure that the endangered species, the most imperiled of all of the ones we were looking at, didn't slip through the cracks. And we were concerned that because there was a lot of vague language, a lot of wishy-washy language that allowed some wiggle room and discretion, that the really, really imperiled species might fall through the cracks. And as we've seen, they have. We filed suit because San Diego is the model for the nation. And we wanted to make sure that we were calling it like it is. We did not want to mislead the rest of the nation or the rest of San Diego even. We wanted to be very honest about what the plan could do and what its shortcomings were. It's critical because these things are taking off across the nation. And our primary goal was to see if there was anything that could be done to fix the MSCP. We support the concept, but what we saw and what we have evidence to show is that the endangered species we were worried about, everything we had feared would happen was happening.
And that, the plaintiffs charged, was the needless destruction of vernal pools, which they believe was the result of weak language in the MSCP.
Vernal just means seasonal or spring. A vernal pool is a seasonal wetland, and nobody knows why the depressions exist that the vernal pools form in. But essentially, all you need are specific soil, a specific soil type that tends to be clay or sometimes hard pan. And what happens is in the winter, all it takes is a little bit of rain and a week of ponding,
and these pools fill up, and all of these species that are specially adapted to that unique environment spring to life, and they can complete their life cycle in a week, and they can stay dormant in the ground up to 15 years, and all it takes is a winter rain. We think that they're remnants of the ancient ocean.
Fairy shrimp are among the species who live in vernal pools on coastal mesas, which again are prime real estate. San Diego has lost almost all of its vernal pools, so Rolf wants protection for those that remain.
It was here at Mira Mesa Market Center. This property is owned by cousins, and this property had 67 vernal pools of moderate quality, sustaining some very important species. 67 vernal pools is a lot of vernal pools to have in one place, and it was the first project to come forward. The MSCP said vernal pools will be avoided, and the council approved the project with impacts to 66 of the 67 vernal pools.
Though the Southwest Center and others tried to stop construction at this site, they failed, in part because of some question over who has the final say on vernal pools.
Vernal pools as they sit are referred to as endemic species that are, there's a policy within the implementing agreement that says you should try to avoid when to the maximum extent practicable. And these unique environmental phenomenon are also covered under the Army Corps, which is not under the Department of Interior, which is who our implementing agreement is with. So there was a third agency and entity, and about 5 years ago we decided not to include wetlands. Vernal pools are a wetland. Wetlands as a type of habitat are not covered by MSCP. There had been a wetlands working group trying to bring wetlands through the Department of Defense instead of Department of Interior into an MSCP format. That was the table that had been set that they walked away from. But the 7 species that reside in vernal pools are part of our 85. So that's where the concern is that we have 7 species that live in vernal pools. Vernal pools aren't technically covered. They were mentioned as wetlands to be avoided. So it is a piece that needs clarification. I don't believe it was a piece that was done wrong, but it is a piece that is not totally finished yet. So I believe there is resolution out there. Depends on which arena we continue to talk.
Vernal pools are covered by the MSCP. We never intended to cover vernal pools, or any wetlands for that matter, through the MSCP because we did not have the Army Corps of Engineers at the table. You have to have the Army Corps of Engineers at the table in order to discuss wetlands because they also regulate wetlands. The developers came to the regulatory agencies at the last minute and said, you know, we really want wetlands to be covered by this program. I was at a meeting where the agencies said, no, we haven't dealt with Army Corps of Engineer. A few weeks later, the wetlands were covered.
What impact does this lawsuit have on the coalition of diverse interests that you've held together for so many years?
Well, I have been told, well, how do I say that? I told you so has been said. I regretfully have to acknowledge that because I had been hopeful that the consensus would hold. And there are a couple of environmental organizations, one mainly and in particular the Endangered Habitats League, that has stuck by their commitment at City Council to support the program and believes that it just needs to be clarified and it's not signed on to the lawsuit. But the development community is saying, we knew this was going to happen. You cut a deal. They didn't get what they want, so they take you to court to get what they want.
While Michael Beck agrees that the vernal pools are at risk, he parted company with the other environmental groups over strategy.
Had this lawsuit not targeted the MSCP, had it targeted, say, the city of San Diego for not implementing the MSCP, that's a completely different story. And that's where we are. You know, had we not negotiated for a fix here, we would have sued the city of San Diego. But first you try to fix through negotiation, and then you left with no other recourse, then of course that's a prerogative of all the stakeholders, the landowners, the environmentalists, the jurisdictions, to file suit. We agreed on something, implement what we agreed on.
With respect to very endangered species, the language of the MSCP is very wishy-washy. There's a lot of room to move. If the city of San Diego uses that wiggle room to wiggle out of protections, Should we blame the city of San Diego, or do we blame the MSCP because the language isn't strong enough? The MSCP should be so strong for endangered species, as strong as the Endangered Species Act requires, so that there is no wiggle room, there's no discretion on the part of the city when it comes to these very, very, very endangered species.
How important is trust?
Absolutely, probably at the foundation level of it, and that's why I believe that's where the serious nature of the lawsuit comes in, is the trust that was established through the negotiated agreement and deal, and what we thought was a handshake with the environmental community has been jeopardized. But we still have the trust of the three permitting agencies, the state, the federal, and the locals, and a handful of environmental organizations that continue to support it, and the building industry that's standing by their word. So the seeds and the roots of trust are still there.
Across the board, for the most part, conservationists are interested in habitat conservation plans, but very, very, very skeptical and very, very, very concerned. And that's not because of us. That's because of independent scientific review. It's because of reports that have been issued. It's because of their own experience. If anything, I think if we can fix it like this, we'll come out stronger, because people will be able to say, you know what, yeah, it had flaws, it wasn't perfect, but we fixed it, and now we can stand behind it. So I think we're doing Bruce Babbitt a service.
The MSCP covers much but not all of San Diego County. The jurisdictions not included are working on their own habitat conservation plans, known as HCPs, with help from Jerry Stalka. And she sees some damage done by the legal challenge.
I know it's made many of the cities worried that a similar lawsuit would happen in the MHCP, or worried that the whole process will just fall apart and we won't be going forward on this. The work in the MHCP has been struggling because the area is so much more fragmented than in the southern part of the county, and I think the city staff are frustrated right now that they have less to work with, and so any impediments like this lawsuit just make it that much harder.
Another concern among advocates is that the public see a united front of support for the MSCP. The 1997 agreement called on officials to create a source of revenue within 3 years that would pay the region's share to acquire, maintain, and monitor this land. Local leaders promised to put a potential tax increase before the voters with a bond measure in the year 2000. If passed, it would guarantee regional funding for the next 30 years. But a crack in that front has some nervous about taking it to a ballot next year.
The environmental community is fragmented now, and as well as the development community is also fragmented, and this process has done that. There are those developers and those environmentalists who see this as the way to go. The HCP process is the way to work out these deals, and then there are those environmentalists and developers, both and private property owners, who think that this is not the way to go, and it fragments on both sides, and so it will be difficult to get the bond issue passed.
But that's not how Allison Rolfe sees it.
Again, I think that's an argument based on an unfounded fear. I think it's absolutely 100% true that the majority of the conservation community here in San Diego had serious concerns with the MSCP. In fact, I know people who have said they couldn't have gone out and campaigned for a ballot initiative because they didn't feel comfortable with the MSCP. But they have told me if we can fix these problems, they'll support it. So again, I think ultimately we have a better chance of passing a bond if people believe in this thing.
As the lawsuit makes its way through the court system, the Multiple Species Conservation Program is moving forward.
You know, it's regretful that we have a lawsuit, but I think everybody expected it. But we have issued permits, we have increased conservation, we have funding coming in, we have still a smaller but still a core of people who support it. People are starting to know more about it. I believe it is working and will continue to.
And that pleases Michael Beck, who believes that the results of the MSCP will sell the program to the public.
Up until now, a lot of the debate has been academic. It has been, there's not enough science. Well, how do you prove that one way or another? You just have professional opinion. There's not enough land, there's not enough this. or there's enough land and there's enough this. There's just kind of this academic debate that has preceded implementation of the plan. You know, we're supposed to be not just conserving land, but restoring it. We have to monitor this in an incredibly sophisticated way. That will give us the ability to measure what we're doing. We'll be able to look at it, and I believe and I hope that this will be very positive conservation. And I hope that that will translate into a stronger conservation ethic throughout the whole community.
A river valley is an area that is formed by water. Over geological time, water has carved out the valley and created this unique environment with the rivers starting in the mountains and running to the coast and emptying into the ocean. And in Southern California, where we have sort of a desert community, we don't have the very many of them, and they are very important and need to be preserved.
San Diego has 7 river valleys, and Diane Coombs has spent the last 2 decades trying to preserve this one, the San Dieguito River Valley that extends 55 miles from Del Mar to Vulcan Mountain near Julian. Though the fairgrounds and racetrack have been open since the 1930s, neighborhood groups wanted to limit additional growth so that San Dieguito wouldn't become like the more populous river valley to the south.
I have to give credit to the citizens in this area who really responded to the development in Mission Valley, as well as the warnings that were given to us in Temporary Paradise, and organized and began to provide the impetus to protect the river valley, and there were definitely threats for the same type of development that occurred in Mission Valley. And from there, elected officials took up the cause and have been very important in the progress that has been made.
The progress is the creation of the San Dieguito River Park. The 6 jurisdictions with land in this valley got together to plan an open space preserve that would cross the various habitats, beginning with the coastal wetlands.
Historically, this whole area was wetlands covered with channels. You can see that man's intrusion with I-5, the railroad, 101, and most obviously the large area of over 300 acres that was filled for the fairgrounds has altered those wetlands. But nevertheless, we hope to be able to restore as much of those wetlands as possible. We move on further to the east, and you'll find that it's more agriculturally oriented. And as you move further, we go through systems of coastal sage onto Lake Hodges, which is a man-made lake here, one of 2. The second one being Lake Sutherland, further to the east. You get away from the coastal plain and into your foothill area, where you have a whole different type of environment and habitats. Finally, as you get into the mountains, you get to an area where you have actually old growth forests, and as you descend into the desert, the high desert habitat. So we think it's unique in that the various landscape units represent every type of landscape in Southern California within one river park area.
A story in a local newspaper inspired planners to take the concept a step further. The San Diego Reader featured one hiker's search for the source of the San Dieguito River, prompting planners to include a coast-to-crest trail that would begin at the beach and end at Ironside Spring on Vulcan Mountain. The park itself was born in 1991 with the purchase of this property, 89 acres near the racetrack.
This is land that was seriously threatened with development. The property owners saw hotels, resorts, commercial development in an area that was immediately south of the river and was almost entirely in the floodway and floodplain fringe, as well as much of it was covered with wetlands. And that particular development was the impetus for a lot of support for the river park.
The next big break came when Southern California Edison chose the San Dieguito Lagoon for a wetlands restoration project. The utility company was required to mitigate for the damage it caused in building the nuclear power plant at San Onofre. After years of study and review, the restoration is to begin next year.
The area behind me that you see will show on the west side of I-5 a wonderful new subtidal basin just north of the existing subtidal basin, and on the east side what are called subtidal areas that will be high, low, and mid-marsh that will provide habitat not only for fish but birds, and a wonderful learning experience for people who can come and learn about wetlands.
While supporters are quick to highlight successes, the Coast to Crest River Park, as critics point out, is still just a concept. Much of the land in the San Dieguito River Valley is privately owned, and the property owners do not have to participate in the river park plan. In fact, some feel that the plan itself threatens their property rights and have challenged it in court. Though the river park prevailed, planners continue to face new obstacles. One is the surf and turf, a proposal to build a shopping center like this one on a lot west of I-5 adjacent to the racetrack.
It would certainly have very negative effects visually. There's a possibility that drainage from the covered surfaces would get into the wetlands and be detrimental. Nighttime lighting is not good for the wildlife, and certainly the additional traffic would create additional air pollution and noise problems.
While opponents just succeeded in getting this project scrapped, they've got another problem here, in the agricultural preserve of San Pasqual. An idea to turn this vacant academy into a juvenile detention center was roundly criticized by the public. Now officials are considering a plan to make this a charter boarding school for older children unable to be placed in private homes. Still, the priority among park planners is to discourage any development that would disturb the surrounding open space and to be consistent with the MSCP and the goals outlined by Lynch and Appleyard.
A lot of the reasoning behind Temporary Paradise was the sentiment in San Diego that we didn't want to become another Los Angeles. And while Temporary Paradise, I think, has helped, we have continued to march along in spite of that to looking more and more like Los Angeles. So open space is important to preserve habitat for plants and animals and areas for people to get away from urban environments for recreation. But it's also important to maintain community identities so that you have green areas between communities that can define those communities.
It was green space within the urban setting that attracted conservation biologist Kevin Crooks to this region.
San Diego is blessed by its topography. It consists of coastal mesas that are dissected by these steep-sided ravines or canyons. Over the past century, all of the coastal mesas have been developed, which have left these canyons to remain as habitat islands immersed within this urban sea of Southern California.
Crooks studies the species that live in canyons, like this one in University City.
Down in this bowl, you have a whole patch of native black sage, which is the flowering plants. These bigger shrubs here are lemonade berry. This is a Baccharis species that often occurs in riparian areas along stream sides. This is a native species of sage. It's California sage, and that's where we get the name coastal sage scrub, which is this plant community. And this is a buckwheat, which is also a characteristic species of coastal sage scrub.
The coastal sage scrub is found primarily on south-facing canyons, while chaparral, the dense bushy plants that need more water, grows on those that face north.
Okay, so this is a north-facing slope in one of the canyons, and it's a good example of chaparral species. These are the bigger shrubs. Now over here on the left is a south-facing slope, and here you have a good example of coastal sage scrub. This slope right here facing us is dominated by California sage. And lastly, I wanted to point out an example of an edge effect. There's the coastal mesa on top of the canyon, there's the house, and you can see how ice plants been planted inside the yard. The problem is that, again, through time, edge effects, such as exotic species such as ice plant, encroach down the slopes, and you see that right here. And as the exotic species encroach, the native vegetation disappears. Eventually, this whole hillside will be exotic species. The chaparral will disappear.
To Crooks, these canyons are precious and must be protected, both from being filled in, as was done here in Claremont, and from road construction, which fragments the habitat.
Carnivores need habitat corridors. They need movement linkages to allow them to go from point A to point B. If an urban development or a roadway severs that corridor or that movement linkage, then effectively the landscape is not sufficient to retain that carnivore species.
He is most concerned about a City of San Diego plan to put roads in 37 urban canyons to improve access to aging water and sewer pipelines.
In the long term, a paved road, even though it does provide access for the city in terms of sewer lines, will create more environmental damage than if there was no paved road in the canyons. Before this proposal was ever brought on board, I've always felt that access to the canyons is the key issue in their protection. I should be clear, I don't think that people shouldn't use these canyons. I think that these canyons are a perfect place for recreation, that citizens can come down to the canyons and hike and bike and bird watch and walk their dogs. That's no problem. But when you put a paved road within a canyon, that opens it up to much too much access. In many of the canyons that already have paved roads, they're basically, the levels of environmental disturbance are very high. There's very few very low native vegetation. It's just not as an attractive place for citizens to come down and enjoy.
And while the MSCP allows for utility access in some cases, Crooks is hopeful that public opinion about these canyons will influence public policy.
As part of my research, I distributed questionnaires to residents bordering these urban habitat fragments, asking them about their perceptions and attitudes towards the conservation of the canyons. And I was very impressed and encouraged by their responses. I received nearly 50% of the questionnaires back, which is unheard of in such a social science survey, which really, I think, exposes that the canyons are near and dear to the hearts of the people of San Diego. And their responses indicated that the vast majority of the citizens are concerned about the conservation of the canyons, including the wildlife within them.
The Seacoast, the warm sandy beaches lapped by the Pacific waves, has long been a draw for many who come here to create their own California lifestyle. The beach is the region's most important asset, says Temporary Paradise, and should be accessible to all. No argument there from the state, as it declared the entire coastline public property. But access is difficult in some cases because of what's missing: the sand.
There's some evidence that we have been losing beach sand because the sand, ultimately, much of the sand comes down from the rivers. They bring the sand during flooding from the east, from the mountains. And much of that sand is being captured behind dams, which we need for fresh water supply in Southern California. As you know, we're living in a semi-desert, in a semi-arid area, and we need all the water we can get, and so we dam it up, and then we redistribute it, and so on. One effect of that is to cut down on flooding, and it's the flooding that brings in the material that brings the sand to the beaches.
Dams and harbors do affect the sand flow, but an even larger force explains why some beaches are more stripped than usual, and that force is nature.
In the late 70s somewhere, it seems that the storm patterns changed and that we had more and more severe storms following that time up until the present time, with a few gaps in between. But generally, between the period of about 1945 or 46 or so till about 1978, we had a relatively calm episode of lower intensity storms, except for a few winters, like the winter of 1969, for example. But by and large, the storm activity was less during those decades than it was in the 20 years since that time.
State oceanographer Reinhard Flick researches shoreline erosion here at the Scripps Center for Coastal Studies.
Storms, of course, create waves, and it's really the wave activity that ultimately causes beach erosion, especially waves, wave storms that coincide with periods of high tides and elevated sea levels. When all those three factors come together, as they did in the winter of 1997-98 and in the memorable El Nino of 1982-83, those three factors coincided. Large waves coincided with periods of high tides and high sea levels, and that is what allows those very large waves to get back into and up high to cause both flooding and beach erosion.
The El Nino was most devastating to beaches in North County, where cobblestones became more common than sand.
Many of the North County beaches between South Oceanside and Carlsbad and Solana Beach, or even northern parts of Del Mar, many of those beaches never recovered, especially the ones in the center part of that area, never really fully recovered from the 1982-83 El Nino winter. And so there has been a lack of sand to buffer the impacts of those waves, not just on the beach, but also in the offshore areas. It looks like there was just a depletion of sand. Because of that, because of the lack of a buffering beach width, the waves during the last El Nino winter were able to flood the parking lots and the road and Highway 101. I think it was closed for over 20 days, about 25 days, I believe it was closed.
They're not as sheltered by offshore islands from storms as other places. Another reason is that there's a fairly active sink for the sand in that system. It goes from north to south and ends up in a submarine canyon in La Jolla, as opposed to, for example, Mission Beach and Pacific Beach, which has a headlands on the north end and has that big jetty on the south end, and that sand moves back and forth in that area, but it tends not to go away as quickly.
And in the case of Coronado, as seen here, there are two factors to explain this wide beach.
The first one, and the most important, is the fact that about 26 million cubic yards of sand were dredged from San Diego Bay during 1946, right after World War II. And that sand was literally pumped out of the bay and pumped onto the ocean side of the Silver Strand Beach, and then from there drifted north and greatly widened Coronado beaches all the way through North Island. The second factor is the stabilizing effect of the small rock groin jetty that's in front of the Hotel Del and the Zuniga jetty, which protects the entrance to San Diego Bay. And those two structures greatly help to stabilize the longshore transport of sand in that region and essentially trap sand there and keep the sand beaches wider than they would be without those structures.
But building structures offshore now is politically difficult, and large-scale dredging of new harbors is also unlikely.
From a development point of view, up until the middle or even the later part of the 20th century, these, what we call now wetlands, were considered swamp and overflow lands. In fact, there's a Swamp and Overflow Lands Act where these wetlands and swamps were not appreciated for their ecological value.
Another sand source, collapsing coastal bluffs, is a slow process, unless they're bulldozed, as was done here in San Onofre to make room for the power plant. So what to do about sand on the beach? SANDAG, the San Diego Association of Governments, came up with 3 options.
First thing one can do is leave the situation alone. And the implications of that is that the coastline is going to retreat over time, and we're going to lose the beaches, we're going to lose the roads and the public infrastructure, we're going to lose the buildings and houses along the coast. That's certainly one option. Another option is to basically what you might call armor the coast. Put in a wall of steel and concrete, seawalls, those kinds of things, revetments to protect the coast from the destructive forces. That again implies that you're going to lose the beaches because the sea is going to come in and take all that land up to those structures. The third option, and the option that we've adopted here in San Diego as the prime thing to do, is to put sand on the beaches, replenish those beaches.
And the source of sand is critical, as planners found out when the Navy dredged the San Diego Bay to make room for new ships and placed that sand on the beach in Oceanside.
The Navy and Sandag worked together to create a project where the Navy would take that sand and put it at the beaches that needed it rather than taking it out to the open ocean and dumping it. In other words, recycling that material, because it's basically the same kind of material that's on the beaches. Unfortunately, what was discovered in the process of starting up that project is that there were munitions in that sand that had been dumped there at various times, and the munitions were showing up on the beach. And as soon as that happened, of course, the Navy stopped the project.
Importing sand from the desert was too expensive, so Sandag instead looked closer to home. The new plan is called the Regional Beach Sand Project.
It's a project that will dredge sand from offshore sources, about a mile to 2 miles off our coast in various spots, and put it at 13 beaches along the region. And the objective is to create about 8 miles of new beaches in the region using approximately 2 to 3 million cubic yards of sand. It would be the first project of its kind, that is solely for the purposes of beach replenishment to this extent in California, and also the first project to use offshore sand sources. And this is the technology, the process that's been used successfully in many other places in the world, but has not yet been applied on the West Coast.
The cross-hatched marks on this map show the offshore sources of sand, and the orange blocks show which beaches are slated to be restored.
These offshore sources are actually relic river valleys and canyons that have been filled in with the sand as the sea level has risen and covered them over.
And how much sand is there in these offshore river valleys?
We've identified about 50 million cubic yards of sand so far with some very specific explorations. So we feel that there's a tremendous amount of sand out there for not only for this project, but for the future.
If all goes as scheduled, the new sand will be on the beaches next summer. Reinhard Flick supports the plan as a place to start.
I think it's a laudable effort. It's really the first regional effort in San Diego. The only regret, I think, is that the quantities can't be larger. It's a shame that there can't be more sand placed at some of these because of the economic constraints, the money constraints, at least on the central parts of the region from Encinitas through Solana Beach. But certainly as an initial effort, I think it's a great idea. Some of the criticisms I have heard is that why put sand on the beach? It's just going to wash away. My personal view of this is that the beaches in urban areas are much like any of the other infrastructure. And for example, to say that, well, why are we paving the roads? They're just going to get potholes in them anyway, is really very similar. In urban areas where we have determined that we need wide beaches, if that essentially political and social determination has been made, then given all these other constraints and all these other physical factors, really the only viable way to do that is to construct the beaches.
Steve Sachs concedes that to truly restore all of San Diego's beaches, it would take 10 times the amount of sand in this project, but the cost to do it all is too high.
The volumes that we're talking about, it does have to be considered a demonstration project. And what we hope to do is show that this technology works on the West Coast and help develop some support for this kind of thing at the state and local levels to see if we can develop a funding program for the future.
Funding for the future to preserve and restore the valleys, canyons, and seacoast is a concern we heard in each of the stories we presented tonight. While the people featured may disagree on details, they share a respect for the land, the natural environment. They know that building will continue, but their work makes the case for conservation so that our legacy to the next generation is not just what we built, but what we spared. I'm Shannon Bradley. Thank you and good night.
Path to Paradise is funded in part by Ogden Environmental and Energy Services, a full-service environmental consulting company that has worked in San Diego since 1972, and by the Burnham Foundation, Solomon Smith Barney, and Public Financial Management. UCSD-TV has joined with Citizens Coordinate for Century 3, the region's oldest nonpartisan civic organization, to produce Path to Paradise as a way to start a conversation about the future of our region. If you would like more information about C3, please call 619-232-7196.